Okay, you are listening to the award-winning Philadelphia Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillychem.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to have some of our regular programming in the beginning, and then we're going to do something a little special at the end. In the second half of the show, we'll be joined by Chris Murray and Donald Hunt, two sports writers, to discuss the new Wilt Chamberlain document and Chamberlain's cultural impact here in Philadelphia. And our own Lance Haver will provide us with an update on the SEPTA budget. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. Again, always shocked when I wake up in the morning and the news says, don't go outside, the air isn't breathable, and somehow that becomes an acceptable thing to say.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how that happened. One day we all said, all right, if you can't breathe the air, we won't do anything. Just ignore it.
Well, and not to delve into this right now, but you have been active on social media with a couple of remedies that would kind of make, or not remedies, but things that might make sense to do when the air quality is dipped. You want to talk about that now, or do you want to talk about it?
No, I was going to say hello to Denise and ask Denise, what do you guys do when they announce the air quality is not acceptable?
Well, we're kind of fortunate here in Wilmington in that we're surrounded by trees near our house, so we don't have, it's not as much of a problem. But I also have a husband with sleep apnea and a history of breathing problems. So we really have to, be on our P's and Q's about that. And the thing is, you can smell it when you walk outside. And the question that I have is the entire forest in Canada ablaze? And when is someone going to do something about that? Because it's been a problem for a while, and American and the air here in the States is already bad enough without that.
I think you make an excellent point that neighborhoods with fewer trees suffer more. And of course, we can guess that poorer neighborhoods tend to have fewer trees, tend to have less greenery, tend to have fewer parks. And those are the neighborhoods that bear the brunt of the worst part of the air pollution.
And you're exactly right about that.
Just one more layer of how racism or environmental racism or economic racism or just outright not caring harms people and harms children.
Mm-hmm. So, Lance, tell us a little bit about what's going on with SEPTA right now.
SEPTA has passed its annual operating budget, and the process that's used is a little strange. But before we talk about that, if we can just call up the slideshow and we can kind of go over what it is. So at the May SEPTA board meeting, the board passed the new budget for SEPTA. $1.69 billion is going to be spent, and that's a 4.7% increase from last year. Now, to think about this, it's important to think about who the SEPTA board is. So the SEPTA board is 17 members, 2 members from each county, so Philadelphia, Delaware, Bucks, Chester, and Montgomery County, the majority leader, minority leader of the state house, majority leader, minority leader of the state senate, and the governor. And that sounds reasonable until you consider that 70% of the system is based in Philadelphia. 80% of the riders are based in Philadelphia, and 80% of what's called the local match, in other words, local tax dollars that go to support SEPTA, come from the city of Philadelphia. So the board is incredibly anti-democratic. The majority of the riders only have 17% of the vote. The majority of the funders have only 17% of the vote. And the majority of the system is really controlled by people who don't have a majority of the system. That board gets together and they hire a hearing examiner. And the hearing examiner came from the disgraced law firm of Eckerd Siemens. I don't know how many of our viewers have been following the tremendously important and investigative story that Joseph DiStefano has been writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer, talking about these quote unquote investments where they were really nothing other than loan sharks and lending money at high interest rates to small businesses. And they had Eckerd Seaman lawyers saying there's nothing wrong with it. Turns out not only was there something wrong with it, it was criminal. The law firm got sued, and the law firm is going to have to pay literally hundreds of millions of dollars. And perhaps the lawyers who were responsible for this are going to actually end up in jail. But we'll have to wait and see that. But so the SEPTA board hires a lawyer from the disgraced law firm, and the hearing process itself is a little strange. So SEPTA puts on a presentation, and they spend probably hundreds of thousands of dollars to get that presentation put on. And then you're supposed to be allowed to ask questions. But the riders are unorganized, and the riders don't have any representation. The riders don't have any technical experts. The riders are not even allowed to ask questions and get answers. All the riders can do is show up and complain. And of course, that doesn't help anything. Just complaining really doesn't do much. So they shouldn't really call it a hearing. They should really call it a public meeting and do away with the pretense that there's anything that can be done. At the hearing, people showed up. They talked about the cash fare versus the key card fare. They talked about how SEPTA is not safe. They talked about all the problems at SEPTA, but it didn't do any good. The hearing examiners wrote only 3 pages. So $1.69 billion, and she wrote 3 pages to explain it. That was it. No evaluation of what SEPTA is doing or not doing. And as we'll see later on, there's lots of questions. But I don't want people to think it's only bad, because SEPTA is making some positive changes. And I want to remind people that SEPTA is a tremendous public institution. It's really one of the few public institutions that serves the working poor. Over 50% of SEPTA riders, their household income is below $35,000 a year. It's our school bus system for our kids to get to school, magnet schools, charter schools, public schools, whatever they are. It's the way that we visit with each other. It's the way we get to work. It's the way we shop. It's the way that we keep cars off of the road. It's the way we keep the air cleaner, because SEPTA buses and SEPTA, the L and the subway, you create far less pollution than single cars. And it's also the way employers get workers to the workplace. You know, if there wasn't a SEPTA, it'd be hard to get low-income workers into those jobs because they don't pay enough for people to buy dependable cars. So SEPTA is just this tremendous institution that serves the public very well, and they're doing some very positive things. And I want to go over that before I raise the issue of what's happening. So for the riders, especially those with key cards, there's some great news this year. First, no fare increases. Again, this is another year without a fare increase and another year without any service cuts. For those who use key cards, and those are the people who are banked, who live in the center city, where it's easy to put money on this card, but not only is the first transfer going to be free, but now the second transfer is going to be free. And that's great, because the way it was designed before, you were punished if SEPTA decided not to have a direct bus near where you lived. So by SEPTA's decision, you had to take a transfer. They charged you more for their decision. That penalty has gone away, and now the first and second transfer are free. Another good point is SEPTA riders who use a weekly or monthly pass can now use the trains in Zone 1. Zone 1 is mostly in the city of Philadelphia, but you can also get to the airport. So this makes it a lot easier for people who work at the airport, and some of the jobs at the airport pay very well, but some of the jobs at the airport don't. Some of the jobs at the airport are working in small stores, working in takeout restaurants, working for jobs that pay, if not the minimum wage, close to the minimum wage. Not everyone at the airport's an airplane pilot. Not everyone at the airport is an air traffic controller. So a lot of the workers now are getting a tremendous advantage. SEPTA has entered into a plan for businesses and universities to be able to get SEPTA passes to give to their employees and their students. So that's a good sign that we're going to be able to increase ridership in the fall. And the city of Philadelphia, as part of contract negotiations, will now give every unionized worker who wants it a SEPTA pass. And I've listed where workers can get those passes for free. This is a benefit of working. Now, the truth is it's really a benefit for the city because it keeps cars off the road. It frees up parking spaces for shoppers and for other people. And SEPTA tends to be more dependable than a car that's in bad shape. So this is a great thing for everyone, and it's a great step forward. So that's really some very good news about what's going on with SEPTA, and really pluses for the SEPTA General Manager, Leslie Richards. SEPTA is attempting to make it safer. Now, this is really a very difficult task, and there is no, in my opinion, there's no magic wand here to wave. SEPTA is adding more police officers, and I think we can all wonder whether that is a solution, but at least it's something. At least they're trying to do something. SEPTA is developing what they call a real-time virtual police force. They're setting up many, many cameras, and they're going to be monitoring those cameras in real time. And to acknowledge how difficult people's lives are and how many people are really struggling and are using SEPTA as a homeless shelter or as a place for them to stay when they're struggling with mental health issues or addiction issues. SEPTA is contracted with 8 outreach teams to try and reach out to those people who are in the stations, who are riding the Broad Street line or the L, and try and help move them into a place that's going to offer those people the type of help they need, rather than force them to continue living in a situation that both harms them and also harms the riding public. So SEPTA is taking steps to do that, but it may not be enough because there's very troubling news. SEPTA's ridership is still below the pre-pandemic level. SEPTA's fare box revenue is projected to continue to be 30% below pre-pandemic levels. Now, I'm going to read a quote from the general manager, so it's not my language, but here is what she says. She says, the level of, quote, antisocial behavior, people evading fares, smoking at subways, cars, abandoning trash, plus a persistent presence in train cars of people experiencing mental illness, homelessness, and addiction, burden the system and make it harder to grow ridership. And I think those of us who ride SEPTA, who ride the L or the Broad Street line, have seen this and know that this is a problem, and a problem that doesn't have an easy solution. But finally, perhaps the biggest troubling news is that SEPTA is going to lose its federal subsidies next year. And SEPTA is very forward about that. It says when it loses its federal subsidies, it will be unable to continue operating. And it is saying and predicting that without that funding, SEPTA is going to enter a death spiral. So without new funding, SEPTA is projecting a 30% fare hike and 20% service cuts. Now, the service cuts will be devastating, especially to SEPTA's quote unquote bus revolution, which is paying millions of dollars to put into effect, because the whole pretext and subtext for the bus revolution is that it's going to be the same amount of bus run, just run differently. But now what SEPTA is saying is unless something is done next year, not only will the fares go up 30%, which will be a huge burden for the working poor, but they'll eliminate 20% of the bus lines, 20%. So all of the work and all of the expense and all of the planning for the bus revolution will be completely wasted because none of what we've been promised will come into effect. Now, that being said, we really had, if we had a real hearing examiner and we had a real hearing, we would have been able to ask some questions. So could SEPTA be doing more to make the system safe and increase ridership, as opposed to what they are doing, which is they've decided that they're going to stash money? SEPTA had so much money coming in from the federal government as a result of COVID that they were able to pay down a $300 million loan well before they had to. So rather than paying it off over time, they took the money, and that money could have been used to hire more police, more outreach, to clean the buses more often, to hire more workers. They decided to use that money to pay off the loan. Second, SEPTA has hidden, and this is an approximate number because the hearing examiner would refuse to require SEPTA to say how much money is in the Fare Stabilization Fund. But we know it was $325 million last year. We think it's going to be $485 million this year. Now, again, if you think about it, that's a $1.69 billion budget. So they're taking a significant portion of their budget and they're putting it in the bank and they're calling it a fair stabilization fund, while at the same time saying our ridership's going to be down and our revenue is going to be down. So they're hiding $485 million. So I said SEPTA's continuing to spend millions on its bus revolution, which is really questionable if we're going to have a significant cut in service and a significant fare increase. And finally, there has been no explanation for why SEPTA refuses to examine who's paying cash to get on the bus. And I want to just make it clear how expensive it is for people who cannot use a key card. And I want to take a moment to explain the key card to those of our viewers who don't ride SEPTA regularly and don't know. The key card is a prepaid card that you can use to get on the bus, the L, the subway, the subway transfer, the subway surface cars, anything that SEPTA operates, you can use the key card for. Now, the key card is really great. You can connect it to your credit card if you have a credit card, or you can connect it to your bank account if you have enough money in your bank account that you're never worried about overdrafting. But in addition, if you live in an area that has machines, these key card machines, and you read English, you can go to the key card machine, take money out of your pocket and put it on the key card. The advantage to having a key card is you pay $2 for the ride as opposed to $2.50. And the transfers, the first transfer is free and the second transfer is free. So for a round trip ticket, even if you use 2 transfers, it's $5. If you don't have a key card because you don't have a credit card, because you don't have a bank account, because you live in Nicetown, or you live in the lower Northeast, or you live in the river wards where there are no machines that are easy to get to, and that's why you're paying cash, that same $5 ride for someone who has a key card will cost you $15. And that's really an outrageous penalty for people who don't have key cards. And what makes it worse is SEPTA refuses to ask the question, why are people paying cash? Now, I have been on the SEPTA buses and been in the subway stops. And when I ask people, why are you paying cash instead of having a key card? The most common answer is, well, I don't ride it that often, and it's not convenient for me to get a key card. So those people are being punished rather than trying to do everything we can to get more people on the buses, to make it convenient and easy and low cost, because ridership is down. There's excess capacity on the L, on the Broad Street line, on the buses, especially at non-peak times. We're not doing everything we can to get people on by charging people far more if they pay for cash. It's also one of those things that's pretty hard to accept because the city of Philadelphia passed a law saying you can't penalize people for paying cash. So if this was a store, they wouldn't be allowed to get away with it. But because it's SEPTA, the city of Philadelphia will not prosecute SEPTA for violating the law, and the city board members won't even raise the issue. The question always is, what do we do? And in this case, there's something very concrete we can do. Representative Joe Hohenstein and Representative Ben Waxman have introduced legislation that would allow for regional taxes to support public transit. Now, if this passes, that would allow SEPTA and all the suburban counties, not only here, but also in Pittsburgh and in York and in Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, and in Lancaster and other places that have regional public transit systems, to figure out how do we raise the money we need to make sure that the roads aren't overcrowded, so the air stays cleaner, so that people can get where they want to go. So those people who are really concerned about the future of SEPTA, and if you drive to work, if you drive on the Blue Route, if you drive on 95, if you drive on the Schuylkill Expressway, you should be exceedingly concerned that SEPTA gets the money it needs, because the last thing you need as a driver is another 200,000 cars ahead of you. And again, I want to be very straightforward about this. Many of the people who are riding SEPTA, as I said, are the working poor. And the idea that they're going to buy brand new cars that are going to function properly all of the time is very wishful thinking. Unfortunately, if people buy a car for $1,500 or $2,000, what they're really doing is renting that car until it breaks down again. And chances are it's going to break down on the highway, on the expressway, someplace where people are trying to get to work. And that, if you're a driver, that's going to be a huge burden for you. So if you're a driver, even if you've never ridden SEPTA, even if you've never been on a public transit, you really should be very concerned and support the bill that Representative Hohenstein and Representative Waxman are putting forward. And you can contact their offices. You can contact your state rep or your state senator and say, we need to give SEPTA and all the public transit systems in our state the same power that public transit systems have across the country, and that's the power to have a regional tax. Now, I think it should be a regional tax on the employers who get the benefit of having workers come to their factories, their stores. But that's a secondary discussion. The first discussion is, are we going to make sure that SEPTA continues to have the money that it needs? And that's where we are. I'm hoping that at some point, SEPTA will start putting billboards up on I-95, on the Schuylkill Expressway, on 76, and say, if you're driving to work, you should be calling, demanding adequate funding for SEPTA. Otherwise, you won't be able to get where you're going.
No, and that's absolutely right, Lance. SEPTA benefits everybody, whether you take it or not, whether or not you use it. It's so fundamentally important. A couple of things, and maybe this is just me reacting a little bit from your reports on the water company. But when we talk about the stabilization, the SEPTA stabilization fund dwarfs the water stabilization fund by maybe a couple $100 million. So what is the purpose of that, and why is it the same kind of deal that the water company has? Like they just wanted to appease bondholders, or what are we talking about here?
So SEPTA, unlike the water department, SEPTA doesn't carry a lot of debt. What SEPTA is saying basically is they plan to fail. They don't believe they'll be successful in getting the taxes they need. They don't believe the public will support them. They don't believe they'll be able to increase ridership. And so they're putting money away for the quote unquote rainy day. So while they're telling everyone they're looking at a 30% rate hike and a 20% service cut, what they're going to do is say, well, we have a little bit of money here we can use to make it not so bad, as opposed to being straightforward with people and honest and saying, look, we have a surplus this year, but that surplus is going to run out and we have to plan for that. Instead, they're saying, well, we're going to run out next year and we're not going to have anything, and we're going to threaten all the riders and all the community by saying 30% fare hike and 20% service cuts. So if SEPTA took half of that fare stabilization fund next year and put it into the operating budget, it would eliminate almost the complete increase in fares and some of the service cuts. But if they say that, they're afraid they're not going to get the taxes that they need, and so that they are hiding it from the public and hiding it from people. Now, some people would say that's not wrong, that the public, if you tell the public the truth, the public won't necessarily do the right thing. I always think it's bad public policy for institutions like SEPTA, the city of Philadelphia, the state of Pennsylvania, to lie about how much money they have and wait to get caught. SEPTA's betting on nobody reporting this, and to date, they've been pretty much right. The only people reporting this information has been us. Unfortunately, the Philadelphia Inquirer has really seen its reporters under attack and had them let go. And so there is no headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer saying SEPTA has $485 million in somebody's friend's bank.
And that's one of the things it comes down to.
Well, here's my question. SEPTA's talked about revamping the key card program. They've talked about sending out an RFP for a new key card program and all of these other different things. When I was in New York, when I was picking up our hometown media award, and I was able to use my Apple Pay to get on the subway, which was clean and well lit and well marked and the whole thing. So I have to wonder, how are you going to, do this stuff with SEPTA Key and stuff when you're crying the poor mouth?
I, I think you're right, but I also think that there's a level of incompetency at SEPTA that we don't talk about very often because they do need more money and they do need permanent funding. But the SEPTA Key Card was a decision that the SEPTA board made, on the old board. The cost overruns were 100%. It cost twice as much as what we were told it would do. They started off with two different types of card, a debit card that you could use like a credit card, and the SEPTA Key Card that you could only use on SEPTA. The SEPTA debit card was such an incredible consumer ripoff with how much it charged for every transaction and how much it charged when you put money on it that SEPTA quietly stopped using it. And SEPTA has never done any type of outreach to riders who are paying cash to find out what system will work and how will it work. And it may be that it's possible that if you develop the right type of system, it will actually pay for itself. I think you're right. I think, though, that SEPTA should be more straightforward with what it's doing, should include the riders in doing what it can. There is a Philadelphia Transit Riders Union. They should be included in all the discussions in the same way that the Transport Workers Union is included in discussions. We need SEPTA. We need public transportation. We need it badly. It is a wonderful institution that serves the working poor, but we need it to be run well, and we need it to be run democratically. And that means realistically looking at the SEPTA board and saying if the city of Philadelphia is 80% of the system, 80% of the local funding, and 80% of the riders, we should have 80% of the votes on the SEPTA board.
Because when you were saying that, Lance, I was thinking, because Mandela Day, the day honoring Nelson, the late Nelson Mandela from South Africa, was yesterday. And I was thinking that this is kind of a mass transit apartheid system that we're looking at here, where the people who use the system the most have the least amount of say, and the people who basically don't use the system as much are getting new bus routes and new regional rail routes, and they're getting more of a say in what goes on, but they're not contributing as much to the system itself as the people who have the least amount of say.
You're right, and perhaps I don't say it often enough, but the subsidies tell that story. The regional rail line, which is used primarily by Caucasians, is much more heavily subsidized. For every dollar someone puts in the proverbial fare box to get on the train, SEPTA puts in $2 for subsidy. For every bus rider in the city of Philadelphia, which is primarily African Americans, for every dollar one person puts in, SEPTA puts in $1. So the wealthier neighborhoods get the larger subsidies and the poorer neighborhoods get the smaller subsidy. And the argument that has been made over the years is, well, people with money are making a choice. They could buy a car and drive into the city, so we have to subsidize the regional rail line to keep them out of the cars and make sure that they use SEPTA. Whereas the people who ride the 4 bus, the Broad Street line, or ride the L or the Broad Street subway, those people are quote unquote captured riders. They don't have any choice. They don't have enough money to buy cars. So we don't have to treat them as well. We don't have to subsidize them as much. We don't have to have bus stations for them. One of the things that's really obvious is when you ride the regional rail lines and you look at the stations. The stations in the suburbs have bathrooms, they have water fountains. They typically have somebody who's going to sell you a ticket you can ask questions of. The train stations in the city are unattended, have almost nothing where you can use a bathroom. In fact, the easiest way to think about it is if you're somebody who has used the train at Fern Rock and used the train at Melrose Park, the difference is just incredible. Melrose Park, nice place to sit in the heat, bathroom, someone working in the ticket office. In Fern Rock, where the train stops, no bathroom, no person. In fact, there's an elevator there that often doesn't work. And when it does work, unfortunately, the people who are struggling have turned it into a bathroom. And those are really the differences. And what the major difference is, if you live in the city, you may have to ride SEPTA for economic reasons. And if you live in the suburbs, there's a tendency to believe that you don't have to ride SEPTA. You're making a choice.
Lance, is it a little too early to know about the legislation that Representatives Dowenstein and Waxman have put up, kind of how that would work, or do we need to wait on
Well,
that?
I would hope we could get one of them on the air in the fall to talk about it. And I think that's really what we should be doing. Let them have a chance to explain it and see if there isn't some support for that position. But right now, I don't, it's always awkward when I make a report and there's nothing that I can say that's going to be optimistic, that gives people a way to interact with government, to interact with society. And here is a way. I mean, there is hope. And people who believe in public transit for whatever reason, people who want to use it, our school bus system, there is something that we can do, and that is we can support these bills. And hopefully in the fall, we'll get Representative Hohenstein or Representative Waxman on to talk about it.
Lance, thank you very much for that. And I'm looking to see if our guests are here yet. Not yet. All right.
Well, let me
Denise,
put in some more information about the water rates. So there was a program to help people who fell behind on their water bills. The program closed. It's reopened again. In our next newsletter, we'll have information about how you can get that grant if you need it. But right now, if you're facing with a water shut off, because the water department is shutting people off again, there is hope for you. There is something that you can do to access federal and state dollars to clear up any back bill you have as a result of COVID or the shutdown, and put you in a better future.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because a friend of mine had her water shut off and was trying to reach the water department after she paid her past due bill and the connection fees, which were substantial, to get her water turned back on. And she called the water department, and first they picked up the phone, they put her on hold and left her on hold for a very long time, to the point where the time ended up expiring, and they hung up on her. I don't know if she's gotten her water turned on yet, but I was like, she was asking me whether or not she would have to physically go to the municipal building to turn the water on, to get the water turned on, or would someone eventually return her call, because they also had the option of, if you would like to get a callback number, if you'd like to call back, punch in your number and someone will call you back.
Well, we should talk about this, because one of the things that we could try and do is have people call us, and we can call the Public Relations Department or the Water Department and find out what's going on. There's absolutely no reason to treat people like that. And it's just shameful that a public institution like the Water Department would treat its own customers so poorly. That's the type of thing you would expect from Exxon or a giant oil company, not something that's supposed to be serving its owners. I mean, we own the water department, the Philadelphia Water Department. Why should it treat us so poorly? And my guess is that the number she was calling isn't even to the water department. It's probably some corporation that the water department contracted out with to answer the phones, and nobody monitors how well or how poorly those outsourced calls are. Those of us who have had to make arrangements to have our water meters changed out, when we called to make the appointment, we were calling Georgia, a company that had been privatized, taking union jobs away from the city, and also jobs that nobody was doing any oversight to make sure they were handled well. But we should think about whether this is a function that we can fulfill for people. People call us with these type of consumer complaints, and that we can go ahead and try and get an answer from the water utility or the electric utility or whoever's appropriate. Why isn't this happening?
No, I think that's great, and I think that's a service we could provide. Taking somebody's water away at any time of year is terrible, but it's doubly so when we're talking about the hottest stretch of the year right here on Third High, and that just shouldn't happen. water basic.
It's all, it also becomes a question of, with all of the technology of how to pay with debit cards, credit cards, all these different ways, it's really kind of questionable why the city hasn't figured out a way of allowing the people from the water department to knock on the door and collect a payment right there. I mean, I don't know how many of us have been to a restaurant recently where somebody comes along with a credit card reader. I guess I was feeling my age when somebody handed me a machine to pay my bill, and I just stuck it in there, and the waitress just brings it from table to table. But if they can do that, I don't know why the water department can't do that and give people an opportunity at the door to make a down payment.
And those are topics we will be covering throughout the summer and into the fall. And for as long as you're doing the show, I think we're going to be talking about these things that we think are fundamentally important. So Denise, would you like to introduce our guests, and we'll talk a little bit about something maybe a little more fun.
Okay. Well, last week at the AMC Theater on Broad Street, there was a screening of the second episode of a three-part documentary series on Wilt Chamberlain, the Basketball Hall of Famer that called Philadelphia Home. For those of you who may not have ever seen Wilt Chamberlain play, or may not have heard of him because we're in a Michael Jordan versus LeBron James kind of world. Wilt Chamberlain was actually what those two people are now back in the 60s and 70s. He was one of the few 7-footers you saw in professional basketball. And he was way, way, way ahead of his time. So much that a lot of the rules that you see in basketball now are directly connected to him and what he was able to do on the court to try to, balance things out so everybody could, be more competitive against a guy who was, bigger and more athletic than just about everybody else on the court. And the documentary, which is on Showtime, you can get it on Showtime. It's streaming right now, and you can also see it on Sundays on Showtime if you don't feel like watching all 3 hours straight. It is a really good, I guess, a portrait of his life, and explain some things about him that you might not have known about, or kind of clears up some misconceptions about the man. So to talk a little bit about this, I'm bringing on Donald Hunt. Donald Hunt is a retired sports writer with the Philadelphia Tribune, someone who is so well known in basketball, especially college basketball circles, that basically people go to him and ask him stuff about things that you might not be able to look up on your own. And he's also one of the folks that spearheaded the effort to get Wilt Chamberlain made into a postage stamp. And we also have Chris Murray, who, in addition to being the host of the Chris Murray Report, he is a columnist with the Philadelphia Sunday Sun, and he's also a friend of the show. So thank you, Don and Chris, for joining us today.
Okay.
Hey, glad to be here as always.
Good to be here. Yep.
So I guess I'm going to start with you, Don.
Mm-hmm.
Wilt Chamberlain, can you tell us, for those of us who may not have ever really heard of him or what he does, can you tell us a little bit about Wilt Chamberlain and why he's important to Philadelphia basketball?
Well, I mean, he's an absolute legend. Let's start there. Really, Wilt was a phenomenal basketball player, a great athlete, just a real icon in the game and outside the game. He was a guy that grew up here in West Philadelphia, was a huge star at Overbrook, where he won a number of public and city championships, and he really dominated the game like nobody that you'll ever see. I mean, he was 7 foot, He could handle the ball. He could take the ball to the basket. He could pass. He could dunk. He could do so many things. And I think it's really important for a lot of young people to know the history of the game. You were mentioning LeBron James and Michael Jordan and players of that nature, and they're all great players. But there was a number of trailblazers that came before them, and certainly Wilt was one of them. And the things that Wilt did in basketball will never, for the most part, will never be eclipsed. I mean, he was the all-time leading scorer for a number of years until, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar broke his record. I believe Karl Malone eventually broke his record, and then, now LeBron James is the all-time leading scorer. But, he's a guy that scored 100 points in one game. That was just incredible. Shot 28 for 32 from the free throw line. Just a dominant player in 1962 when he did that. And then in addition to that same year, he averaged 50 points a game, 50 points and 25 rebounds a game that year. And he's a guy that before he came into the NBA, played with the Globetrotters. And the Globetrotters, for a lot of people, particularly African Americans that were growing up during the 50s and 60s, that was the team in terms of basketball. And when Wilt left Kansas, he couldn't go directly to the NBA at that time until, a few years later when he became draft eligible. He went and played with the Globetrotters and did really well and played with some great players on the Globetrotters as well. And I think the documentary really shows that, and so many other things too. And they interviewed a number of people that clearly showed why Wilt was such a tremendous player, but an interesting person and an icon himself.
Okay. Now, Chris, as someone who studies sports culture and has written about sports culture, in fact, I'm just going to take a point of personal privilege to congratulate you on winning for your sports columns with both the Keystone Awards, which are given by the Pennsylvania News Association and the Society for Professional Journalists for your columns on sports and the culture. What does Wilt Chamberlain mean from a cultural perspective? And also, why, I guess, what did you learn anything about him from this documentary that you didn't know?
Well, the thing is, Wilt Chamberlain was a pop culture icon before even Ali, even before a lot of athletes in terms of black athletes. Now, you had Jackie Robinson, who had crossed the barrier for, for blacks entering baseball, entering integrated sports. But Chamberlain was someone who was first to really cross, that line of cultural hero. He had a he had a personality that, everyone loved him. He owned businesses. He was a guy who, remember, he owned Wilt Small's Paradise. And Small's Paradise is a very famous place where I think Malcolm X was, had once come through Small's Paradise before he found Islam. And so from that perspective, Wilt was the first guy of style in the NBA, not even really in sports, because I can't think of any other black athlete who came and played in the 1960s who was somebody that he had his own style outside of the sports, and he was a businessman. He really was trying to, and that was the thing I got out of the series, and out of watching all three of those episodes. And another thing that series did for me, and Don, you might want to, you might agree with me on this, is that it was a more nuanced discussion of his career as a player. Because we talk about this whole Michael Jordan, LeBron thing, and everybody wants to note championships only, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And that was the thing I got out of the series, and I understood what kind of man he was. He was another one of those heroes who was like in that era, because you had Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, and Bill Russell. You had men who were their own man, who didn't, who walked around like they were proud men. They didn't go kowtow to anybody, and that's who they were. So that's what I got out of it.
Now, you said that you thought that it presented a much more nuanced thing about winning and losing, because one of the things that was kind of like, attributed to Chamberlain is the fact that people couldn't win the big one with him, even though he did win a championship for the Philadelphia Warriors. Or was it the
Lakers?
76ers.
And it was the Sixers.
76ers.
Okay. And so, even though he did win a championship for his hometown, he still had that kind of had that monkey on his back. Can you guys talk a little bit about that?
Don, you can go first.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah. Well, that was very unfair, because, the Philadelphia 76ers, and before that, the Warriors, who Wilt played for, they lost to the Boston Celtics on a number of occasions. I mean, Boston had a great run. Matter of fact, the Celtics won 8 straight championships before Wilt's 1966-67 team defeated them. And I think this was brought out in the documentary, but I remember Harvey Pollack saying that Bill Russell played with, and listen to this, 10 Hall of Famers. That's a lot, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a whole lot, 10 Hall of Famers, all right? So, and I think another thing in the documentary that really stuck out to me was they had the one part, I think it was 1965, when Wilt was playing for the 76ers at the time. The game was really close coming down the stretch. And I think in the last 15 seconds, Wilt scored like 4 points. He had his 2 foul shots, and then he had a monster dunk. And the game brought the 76ers within 1 point. And Boston had the ball out of bounds. And Bill Russell threw the ball, and it hit the supports of the basket. I don't know if you guys remember that part. I never saw that before. Mm-hmm. I always saw the part where they said Havlicek stole the ball. Mm-hmm. But Bill Russell tried to inbound the ball, and he had an unbelievable turnover in my view, And basically, if Havlicek didn't steal the ball, he would have wore the goat horns for that season.
Absolutely.
That was incredible. I've never seen that before. I always knew that the 76ers inbound the ball, and Havlicek stole it, and they won. But it just proves that he was surrounded with great players. And what happened a lot of times when Wilt played with either the Warriors or the 76ers, the teams were fairly even in terms of starting five. I mean, Boston still had an edge, but when the 76ers or Warriors went to the bench for their reserves, that is where Boston had a huge edge, okay? So Russell benefited from that. And Russell was a great player because he played at the University of San Francisco, and he won 3 national championships there. He was a terrific player. But Wilt was a real dominant player, I mean, he could do it all, And I think that, a lot of people, get a lot of things misconstrued. And by the way, he won 2 championships, 2 NBA championships. The 66-67 team, despite losing to Russell's team, that was voted by the NBA sports writers as the greatest team in the history of basketball. Okay. And that team had Wally Jones, who was interviewed, had Wilt, had Lucius Jackson, had Billy Cunningham, who was interviewed, and Chet Walker. Okay. And then, of course, a few years later, he won a championship with the Los Angeles Lakers. So, and that was a great team with Gail Goodrich, Jerry West, Wilt Chamberlain, Jim McMillan, and those players. So he had a tremendous career, and you know, you're only as good as the players around you. Like, Will couldn't beat the Celtics until, he had the players around him, as great as he was, because he was going up against a juggernaut, you know. And in 66, 67, they handled the Celtics very easily, because they had Chet Walker, Hal Greer, Wally Jones, and all those guys. So I think he gets a bad rap with that. But I thought the documentary explained a lot, and it also showed the different great players that played during that era. I mean, there was some big time players that played, so it was very good.
Yeah, and Don, it's interesting you mentioned that that those losses to the Celtics. I think the combined total in those game sevens was like 9 points,
Right.
and then there was an interesting statistic that they showed because not Russell, but Chamberlain said the most heartbreaking loss of his career wasn't at the pro level, was losing the national championship to North Carolina in triple overtime. And the thing about it, one of the things that the documentary showed was the stat total. Basically, Russell was like, I think shot like 47%, accounted for 23 points, and pulled a certain amount of rebounds. The rest of the team was like 5 or 6 out of 34. The rest of the team, and it goes to the point to when I hear these discussions about the GOAT, LeBron, or people say, well, Jordan won all these championships. Jordan didn't win without a supporting cast, okay? Neither did LeBron James. I mean, LeBron James, in many respects, had a lot of guys around him, and this is team basketball. You don't win in sports without playing as a team. And I that was the thing. And I think, everybody says Russell was the ultimate team player. Chamberlain did his part. I mean, Chamberlain, made those guys better around him. And a lot of the coaches he had more stability with the coaches and whatnot and better players, he might have won some of those. And like you said again, if, 2 of those championships, he might have won about 3 or 4 more of those championships had it not been for the Havlicek play, for Sam Jones hitting a clutch shot, I think in game 7 in one of those series. I mean, a lot of times you have to, and then Billy Cunningham getting hurt in 1967, not having him on the court. So, I think these discussions, when I hear it, I kind of look at it like, come on, you guys, you got to get away from all that. But I also think that in terms of the things that he did off the court, he was one of those people. He was the living embodiment of what Richard Nixon called black capitalism. He was trying to help people with businesses. He was ahead of his time. I mean, this was a guy who embodied style, and it was a guy who, after his playing career, as someone said, didn't have to work again. I mean, this guy, did his money right. He was smart, and he was intellectual. He was everything. So I like I said again, I know I talk too much, so I'll stop.
No, that's okay. No, you made some great points.
Yeah, but I also wanted to get Larry in because he had some questions.
Okay.
Larry?
Well, I have one that I've just been dying to ask, and so I'm going to ask. When I was growing up, it was always, Michael Jordan is the greatest player of all time. And when you go back and you look at Wilt, I think that gets challenged a little bit, right? Because you're talking about a player, like Don said, 100 points a game before the 3-point line was implemented, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely.
If you're going to try to compare, maybe for the younger people who maybe didn't get a chance to see Wilt play, is there a player today that is close to what Wilt was, or do you have to take a composite and build a Wilt Chamberlain from existing players? Like, how does he kind of fit into this conversation for today's time?
Well, first of all, he's an icon. I mean, I don't see anybody that's like Wilt today. I really don't. I mean, you're talking about a guy, like they said in the documentary, they wanted him to stop scoring. He was scoring so much that they wanted him to, spread the ball around a little bit. So he went and he led the league in assists. He led the league in assists. He's a center, rebounds. I mean, like a lot. I'll tell you one thing, Larry, don't be nobody, and I shouldn't say nobody, but it'll be really rare if anybody breaks his rebounding record. He grabbed 23,000 rebounds in his career. 23,000.
That is unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. And today, if you get 10 rebounds a game or 15 rebounds a game, Wilt got 55 rebounds. Teams don't even get 55 rebounds.
Yeah,
I mean,
see, that's...
and another thing too, they didn't really keep block shots, but there were games where he blocked like 10 shots in a quarter. I mean, and then the plays that he made are just, unbelievably athletic. And I mean, like he blocked a shot someone took out of the corner at its apex, and he was shooting it on an arc to get it over Wilt, and he still got it. I mean, he's just amazing. And you're talking about a guy that came into the NBA as a rookie, and I'm not all about stats, but Wilt was so phenomenal. He averaged 37 points and 27 rebounds a game as a rookie. Now, you let me know the next time anybody does that. Rookie, all-star, free agent, Hall of Famer, let me know. Give me a call, send me a text, send me a letter, anything. I mean, he was really special. And, he played around the basket, which I liked, and I mean, just a lot of little things, like people would pass him the ball, he would pass it back out, he would get closer to the basket. He had a fall away, he had a finger roll, he ran the floor, like if he, on defense, he'd get the rebound, he'd get out and run the fast break, and you don't see that today. I mean, Wilt was really one of a kind, and he was a guy who was very athletic. Very athletic. I mean, he can handle the ball, he can dunk, he shoot the fadeaway. I mean, the first time I saw him was in 1966-67 when they won the championship. And, boy, he went up and grabbed a rebound, and I just couldn't believe it, And and then he knew how to play the game. See, that's the other thing. A lot of these guys were very fundamentally sound and had a great knowledge of the game and knew what they could do and knew what they couldn't do. So I mean, I just think he's in a whole nother different category. If you talk to a lot of guys now, they'll use a lot of analytics and that kind of thing, but none of that really applies to Wilt.
And for a 7-footer to be that athletic,
he's tremendously athletic. I mean, he was, in high school and even in college, like Chris was mentioning the championship against North Carolina. He played at the University of Kansas. And by the way, he was kind of a trailblazer too, because there weren't many African-American athletes at Kansas during that time. So that's another thing Wilt did. But when he played in that championship game, they had like 4 guys around him, And something that Chris pointed out, that I think was pretty fairly evident in the documentary. I think his best coach was Alex Hannum, because he was a guy, right? He was a guy that could really talk to Wilt, could really handle Wilt, was very knowledgeable of the game of basketball, and made Wilt a better player, even though he was already a great player, and that came across really, really big. So if he played today, he would average 60 and 70 points a game. I mean,
he would have a 3-point, and he would have a 3-point shot.
Right, without the 3-point shot, there's nobody that could stop him. And then he would get underneath the basket, he would grab everything, and then he would block everything, and you see these guys driving down the court, they would drive one time and get their shot blocked, and I'll guarantee you they won't come back down the court with Wilt in there. I mean, he was just phenomenal.
Well, we have
You
to leave
know?
it. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll say right now, the best player in NBA history played here in Philadelphia, and that's Wilt Chamberlain. So thank you so much for joining us, both of you.
Well, thank you
Thank
for
you,
having
thank
me.
you, thank you
Really
for having
appreciate
us.
it. Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
everybody. Thanks, Denise, Larry, Chris. Good seeing you, and congratulations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good to see you too.